Everyone, and welcome to our live stream at Mint Press News. I'm very excited to be joined by two very special guests today for an urgent live stream that we have put together that we hope that many of you will join us today to discuss, which is the push for war over the crisis in Ukraine and also the complete media blackout over the genocide that's taking place in Yemen after the United States, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia blocked the entire country's internet for several days, blocking communications from the rest of the world. So while we do have this push for, this war and confrontation with Russia over Ukraine, lacking from this is all of the context about how this crisis came into play and how these same actors and players within mainstream corporate media who are pushing for this confrontation with Russia and who are pushing this narrative about a Russian invasion, are the same people that are completely silent to the US, UAE, and Saudi-backed coalitions massacres that are taking place in Yemen. And when Yemen is covered, it's covered through the lens of an Iran Houthi alliance lens, and it's never through the lens of what is taking place on the ground. And so we have two special guests with us today. We have Ben Norton, who is from his new outlet. He's coming to us from Multipolarista, formerly with The Gray Zone. And we have Alan McLeod, our senior staff writer at Mint Press News. And just before we get started into this conversation, we recently launched our citizen activist membership campaign. And of course, within the first week, we completely crushed our campaign. So we really, really appreciate all of those who joined us. But we have extended our campaign for 2 more weeks. We've expanded even our goal. We've tripled it, and we're almost at the finish line. So we'd really appreciate if you support the work of Mint Press News, our anti-war, anti-imperialist coverage. Please consider becoming a member as we face shadow banning and suppression from big tech giants. We're calling on you to support and sustain anti-war journalism, nonpartisan journalism. We'll never be pushing, a left-right paradigm. We're always breaking that paradigm for you guys. So I hope you join us today. So we are currently live on Rockfin and YouTube and Facebook, and we are going to continue to stay live on those 3 platforms. So once again, if you're just joining us now, we're talking about 2 flashpoints in the world, Ukraine and Yemen. War drums in Washington are beating louder as the tensions between Russia and Ukraine mounts, and many of the same voices that cheered on America's forever wars are demanding a new one against Putin. Now, Max Boot, who supported wars in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and Syria, is arguing that America should become a world empire. He has demanded that the U.S. cannot afford to leave Ukraine and Europe's at Putin's mercy. Now, former Obama and NATO advisor Evelyn Farkas stated bluntly that the U.S. must prepare for war against Russia over Ukraine. Meanwhile, Politico runs pro-war headlines that state, should the U.S. rattle Putin's cage, even as its coverage is openly sponsored by Lockheed Martin, suggesting that perhaps there are powerful forces pushing us towards a conflict that is in very few people's interests. We're talking about 2 nuclear powers, the United States and Russia. So a conflict between the 2 countries would be completely devastating to not just the region there, but to the world over. And now we have openly Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, think tanks that are funded by NATO, think tanks that are funded by weapons manufacturers, are sponsoring these headlines. They're the ones who are on mainstream corporate media pushing for these wars. And so I'm just going to quickly share some headlines really quickly. So 1 second. The first headline we have is from The Sun, and it states, the West must prepare for the worst as Russia warns U.S. to back off Ukraine or endanger its security amid World War III fears. Okay, so we have another. I'm just going to share a couple of headlines here just to show how extreme these headlines are. The second headline is from, how did I do that? I'm going to go back here. All right, since this is taking me kind of a long time, maybe I won't share all the headlines that we prepared, but U.S. intelligence indicates Russia preparing operation to justify invasion of Ukraine. Again, that narrative of that Russia is invading Ukraine and not the other way around. And of course, when we look at some of these headlines with U.S. intelligence, a lot of these intelligence are anonymous. And so I'd like to start off, I do have a couple more headlines, but it's taking me a little bit more time to share them. So I'll just wrap that up. I want to start off by talking to you, Ben. If you can give us kind of your assessment of what exactly is taking place right now, and how likely do you think it is that Russia will indeed launch a so-called invasion of Ukraine, as many are predicting right now?
I'll answer your latter question first because it's easier. Very low, and that's a quote. Low is a quote from the defense minister of Ukraine, who told ICTV, which is a major Ukrainian TV outlet, that the chances of Russia invading are, quote, low. He also gave a speech in which he said very explicitly that there is no evidence that Russia is planning to invade Ukraine, that Russia has not deployed the forces in the way that it would need to invade Ukraine, and that the forces that Russia has are inside Russian territory, and they are not planning on invading Russia. They're not planning on invading Ukraine. So what's incredible about this whole hysteria, this media manufactured crisis, in scare quotes, is that it is entirely a crisis created by the United States and the United Kingdom. It is not even a crisis created by Ukraine, which frankly is not even really a sovereign government. The Ukrainian government that is in power right now is only in power because of a 2014 coup that was orchestrated by the US government. One of the key figures in that coup in Ukraine, in the so-called Maidan events in 2014, was Victoria Nuland. Victoria Nuland is the queen of neoconservatism. She's married to the king of neoconservatism, Robert Kagan, and she was a high-level State Department official in the Obama State Department, and now she's the third in command of the Biden-Blinken State Department. Both Nuland and Blinken are extreme anti-Russia hawks. They have cut their teeth as political figures on anti-Russia hysteria. That's what made them who they are as political figures. And both of them, along with, by the way, across the pond, Boris Johnson, who is trying to distract from his scandal at home, where he violated, COVID policies and had all these parties, and is desperately trying to hold on when there's even a rebellion within the Conservative Party. We see that it's Washington and London that are driving this narrative. Washington that is spreading this ridiculous conspiracy theory without a single shred of evidence, that is attributed by CNN to anonymous U.S. intelligence officials, claiming that Russia is planning to launch a, quote, false flag operation, according to CNN, which is hilarious because the corporate media has told us for many years that the existence of the idea of a false flag operation is itself a conspiracy theory. A government would never do that. But now CNN, citing anonymous U.S. spies, is claiming that Russia is planning on killing Russian-speaking Ukrainians, that is, Ukrainian nationals who are ethnic Russians, in order to do this four-dimensional chess to invite itself in to invade Ukraine. And then after this ridiculous lie came out, which is a new version of WMDs, the same kind of trusty anonymous spies who brought us great hits like Russiagate and Babies in Incubators and Muammar Gaddafi giving Viagra to his soldiers. Well, across the pond, we see the Boris Johnson administration and the defense minister, Ben Wallace, who's another anti-Russia hawk, obsessive anti-Russia hawk. We see them with an even more ridiculous claim that Russia has this advanced, very articulate conspiracy that it's going to invade Ukraine, remove all of the government officials, and then it already has a cabinet choice of people that no one has ever heard of. Most of them are not even in Ukraine, by the way, and it's going to install a so-called puppet regime. I mean, the point of this is that it is Washington and London that are driving this crisis. To be fair, it's not even the so-called West. I mean, usually the Western powers, when it comes to war and empire, are pretty united. But in this case, even France and Germany, France,
Right.
the colonial power, which is still very much oppressing Africa, which is actually also involved in the war in Yemen, even France is warning against this. Emmanuel Macron, a neoliberal banker turned president of France, he is actually sponsoring peace talks with Russia, and he's doing so in Paris. And we've seen Germany as well. The new government of Scholz, Olaf Scholz, the new chancellor from the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, he has actually taken German-Russian relations in a somewhat different direction and said that Germany does not want a crisis in Ukraine, that they should actually abide by the Minsk Accord, which is never mentioned in Western media. A lot of people don't even know what the Minsk Agreement is. The Minsk Agreement were these agreements that were brokered by European governments between Ukraine and the breakaway republics in the east, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and Ukraine, the Western puppet government in Kiev, has violated almost every facet of that agreement, of the Minsk Accords. So the reality is that if you listen to what Ukrainian officials are saying, including President Zelinski, again, who's someone who doesn't even really have much sovereignty, or if you listen to the defense minister, who just gave a speech saying there's no evidence Russia is going to invade Ukraine, this is not a crisis even coming from the Ukrainian government, as awful and corrupt and illegitimate as that government is. This is purely a creation of Washington and London. And that's why I'm actually glad that today we have representatives of both sides of the Anglo-American axis of war, because it's not just Washington, it's London that is driving this insanity.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to understand the context here. And you made a lot of really good points. And one of them that I want to highlight is just the major conflict of interest of these very people who created the Ukraine crisis in the first place by arming and funding Nazis with the help of our famous neocons through Victoria Nuland in the year 2014, that basically created the crisis in the first place. They're back now within mainstream corporate media pushing these headlines. And they're the ones who are being cited over and over again as the experts for this conflict. And you're right, there's a lot of resistance taking place when it comes to countries like France and Germany in this situation. Alan, I want to take it to you, since you specialize in media propaganda. You're a scholar in media propaganda. I would like to know, kind of based on your research, who are these people that are being cited within mainstream corporate media? If you can share some headlines and their ties to weapons manufacturers and NATO.
Yeah, sure. I mean, feel free to share any headlines you've got. But generally, I think you touched on it earlier, Minar, when you were talking about these anonymous officials leaking facts to the press. This has really become a cancer in modern journalism, where journalists just accept what national security state figures tell them as the gospel, even if they refuse to put their names to it, which is really extraordinary. As journalists, you're trained to always get a name for the source. And the reason for that is that without a name there, sources can essentially burn journalists and just tell them lies and get away with it scot-free. And as a journalist, you're supposed to be critiquing powerful people. And ultimately, national security state advisors, people like that, are some of the least credible people journalistically that you can talk to. And yet these people are allowed to dictate the agenda and set what we talk about, really, without even giving their names. It's astonishing that, somebody in Washington can say something like Russia is really bad and then refuse to even put their name to that. And then places like CNN or the New York Times will print that. A couple of weeks ago at Mint Press, I was speaking to a CIA whistleblower who actually went to prison for a while for releasing documents about torture. And he asked for anonymous, to be quoted anonymously, and we refused. And so that's the sort of level of imbalance when you're talking about who are these sorts of people and why are they being quoted. A lot of the guys who are really pushing this idea of war come from think tanks like the CSIS, CNAS. There's a huge alphabet soup of them. They're all in what we call colloquially Raytheon Acres in Virginia, which is this ring around Washington, D.C. of very expensive, exclusive suburbs where all of these organizations seem to have their headquarters. So many of them are actually funded by weapons companies, which is another reason that we should be doubly suspicious of what they're telling us. Because, of course, companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon are making out like bandits, and they would be absolutely in the money if there was any sort of increased conflict, especially with a nuclear power like Russia. If you check the stocks of groups like Northrop Grumman, Lockheed, or not Boeing, or Raytheon, you'll see that their stocks are nearing all-time highs right now. And that's specifically because people are buying their stocks, assuming that there are going to be large weapons orders being placed in the near future because of this campaign. And because of that, I am particularly suspicious about this whole thing and whether this isn't sort of like playing to the crowd in order to try to get President Biden or Prime Minister Johnson to put these big orders in to try and drum up fear of Russia and create a new Cold War to, as Ben said, kind of distract from home. Ultimately, I think it's pretty unlikely that there's actually going to be any kind of serious hot war between Russia and Ukraine, and even less so between Russia and the United States. If you look at the actual troop numbers Russia has near the Ukrainian border right now, it's nothing like the sort of levels that they would need to properly invade a large and pretty well-armed country in Ukraine. It seems that the Ukrainians have a similar number of troops facing off against the Russians. And so that would be an utter bloodbath if anything did happen. And of course, it seems doubly unlikely that that would happen during the Russian winter, which is notorious for how difficult it is to make aggressive maneuvers militarily, going back 200 years to the time of Napoleon. And so, yeah, ultimately, one thing I do want to warn is, though, that accidents can happen. And with this sort of heightened rhetoric, people getting very nervous, sometimes things happen by mistake. Missiles get launched. And even if nobody wants it, we could be ending up into a really, really perilous situation.
Right. And I want to talk about two main things within this about this conflict that are really not there's no context provided in any of the coverage that's being provided within mainstream corporate media. And a lot of like this, fear of Russia propaganda that's being pushed by mainstream corporate media, when it comes to people on the left or the so-called left or the establishment left, lost in all of this propaganda are the real reasons why the United States fears, Russia, and why it is in Russia's backyard to create the crisis in Ukraine in the first place. So, Ben, if you will, there's two things I want to talk about. Number one, I think it's really important that we just go back to 2014 and the Maidan Revolution. And look at, you briefly mentioned it, I briefly mentioned it, Alan briefly mentioned it, but I want to go into more detail about the United States funding and arming, Nazis, who these groups were, and how this basically pushed Russia out of Ukraine, I guess you could say, and how this whole Cold War, really started. And then the second thing, if we can talk about maybe right after that, is really how this is, like most conflicts, an issue about gas and oil dominance. U.S. oil and gas companies want to dominate, the oil and gas industry, and for Western corporations to be the ones that are reaching, European countries, including Germany and Western Europe, with natural gas for heating. And the United States wants to prevent Russia from being that dominant player in that. So I'd like to start with 2014 and the Maidan Revolution, Ben, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's incredible is the fact that it's portrayed as a revolution. That's the narrative. Is right. Euromaidan was this great uprising, supposedly against a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. That's the narrative that we hear in Western corporate media, and that these peace-loving moderate rebels overthrew the government to install a pro-Western democratic government. That's absolutely ridiculous.
That's like the narrative for every conflict.
Exactly. It's like Mad Libs. Just replace the country with bad country targeted for regime change, and it's all like, so Kazakhstan last month, Ukraine, Venezuela, Nicaragua. Okay, so
We got it.
obviously that's the ridiculous cartoon narrative. The narrative for adults, the actual reality, is that in late 2013, the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who was democratically elected. Now, he certainly wasn't some great, leftist, progressive, anti-imperialist guy. No, I mean, he was democratically elected. And the reality is you're dealing with the country of Ukraine, which doesn't have a strong left. It also is a very corrupt country. It's one of the most corrupt governments in Europe. And the reality is, yes, there's a lot to criticize about the Yanukovych government, but it was democratically elected and it was overthrown by violence. And the main muscle in this coup in February 2014 were fascists, were groups like the right sector, the so-called Pravi sector, which is a far right. They were far right nationalists, and also groups that became paramilitaries like the Azov Battalion, which is a neo-Nazi white supremacist group. Now, what was the spark? There's always a spark that initiates these so-called color revolutions, right? There's a narrative that they use to justify it. And the narrative was that in late 2013, President Yanukovych canceled an agreement that was being brokered with the European Union that was essentially basically kind of a free trade agreement. It was an economic agreement with the European Union to have this neoliberal trade policy between the EU and Ukraine. And he ended up, toward the end of that agreement, he ended up rejecting that agreement and instead ended up signing an agreement with Russia, which was used as evidence that supposedly he was a Kremlin puppet. The reality is that Yanukovych is often referred to in the media as a pro-Russian president. And in reality, he was a middle-of-the-road Ukrainian president who played Russia and the West against each other for whatever was in the interest of Ukraine, which, I mean, that's what any independent sovereign country would do. But if you refuse to be anti-Russian, then you're called pro-Russian according to the West, right? Because anything that you do that doesn't involve attacking Russia, trying to overthrow the Russian government, calling Putin a blood-sucking evil dictator, then you're called pro-Russian. So Yanukovych was overthrown. Again, there were protests. They were taken over by far-right violent elements, just as we saw in Syria and Libya and so many of these countries. We saw many top U.S. government officials were physically on the ground supporting this coup, including Victoria Nuland, I mentioned, including other top U.S. officials. I want to remind people also that Joe Biden was the Obama-Biden administration's point man for Ukraine. The coup in Ukraine in 2014, back when Joe was still somewhat, coherent, that was actually largely one of his projects. So it's not surprising to see that now that he's definitely not so coherent anymore, he surrounded himself with the very same architects of the 2014 coup in Ukraine, including Victoria Nuland. Jake Sullivan is back. He was a major Hillary Clinton ally. And of course, Antony Blinken, who is a hardline anti-Russia hawk. He has been his entire career. So we can't understand the situation today without understanding that coup and the entire narrative, which is absurd. And then furthermore, let's look at what happened with the two presidents since. The first president in Ukraine was Petro Poroshenko, a billionaire oligarch referred to affectionately as the Chocolate King because he made his fortune being a billionaire who had a monopoly on chocolate in Ukraine. A total empty vessel, a neoliberal. But I want to remind people that when he was running for president in this absolutely absurd process that you cannot call in any way democratic, he was actually he was seen as a more conciliatory consensus candidate. He was not even seen as like the most hardline anti-Russia candidate. But what happened is that when he became president, he just obediently followed orders from Washington. We have leaked recordings, and it's likely that those recordings came from Russian intelligence, but they're real recordings in which Victoria Nuland is on the phone speaking to the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and she names the people who are going to be the cabinet members of Poroshenko. So now, ironically, London is accusing Moscow of planning to invade Ukraine and installing a puppet regime in Kiev, as they said. That's exactly what the U.S. did in 2014. Yeah. And we have evidence of Victoria Nuland on the phone saying, this guy should be prime minister. He was prime minister. This guy should be economic minister, etc. So Poroshenko is an empty vessel, and okay, he was eventually his term ended, and he was replaced by the current president, Vladimir Zelinski. And I want to remind people again that he was elected, and again, you can't really call Ukraine a democracy because Zelensky has imprisoned, put on house arrest the main opposition leader, Viktor Medvedchuk, who's accused of being pro-Russian, which again means he's not anti-Russian, so he's called pro-Russian. He's under house arrest for the crime of not being anti-Russian. And Zelensky has also shut down multiple media outlets that criticize the government, including Kiev Post, which is a pro-Western media outlet. But again, it wasn't sufficiently anti-Russian. So the point is that Ukraine is not a democracy. But the reality is that to the extent that there was a legitimate election, which is very little, Zelensky won the election running in a campaign promising the Ukrainian people that he wanted to pursue peace with Russia. And what happened? He came into office. I should mention that Zelensky is a former actor. The only experience he had as a politician was playing a politician on TV. He has no political experience. He entered office in Ukraine and immediately did a 180, began continuing the hardline anti-Russia policies, and has obediently followed his orders from Washington and Brussels. So again, as I said, Ukraine is not a sovereign country. Ukraine's government has been created by the US, NATO, and the European Union, and now Britain. And its officials follow orders obediently from the West as the West keeps sending them weapons. And even though top Ukrainian officials are saying publicly that Russia has no plan to invade, the US and London and other NATO client states like Estonia keep sending all of these weapons into Ukraine because they're the ones who want a war. Even the Ukrainian puppets don't want a war because they're the ones who are going to die if there's a war with Russia. The people in London and Washington and Brussels are not going to die.
Well, and I think that just goes to show just how powerful the military-industrial complex, is. Sending all of these arms in is going to just it's going to continue to fuel this crisis. And who benefits? It's not the people on the ground, even those people that don't want the war who are, pulled in. It's the weapons manufacturers. They're the ones who are benefiting. They're profiting from this crisis. And that's why they keep sending weapons in. It's to keep this country in civil strife. I mean, Ukraine, since the US installed this very right-wing Nazi government, and movement has been found to commit very grave human rights abuses, torture sites being set up, black sites being set up, people being kidnapped and disappeared, lots of violence against ethnic minorities, and so much strife. And the people of Ukraine are really, really suffering. And the people, on Wall Street, the Biden administration, the neoliberal and neoconservative war hawks are just profiting more and more. So most of the coverage, Alan, obviously presents itself as NATO acting in defense, right? They're acting in a defensive way. Talk to me about the framing of this narrative within mainstream corporate media, and what are the outlets that are pushing this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not really, much of a fan of the Russian government as like a sort of conservative, authoritarian place. But, as somebody who comes from a NATO country, in fact, all three of us do, we should be focusing our attention on what our governments are doing, because we theoretically, as long as we live in a democracy, do have some sort of say over it. And, really, I think you have to go back to the end of the Soviet Union to really understand a little bit of the history of NATO. I mean, it was started in the late 40s as a defensive organization whose job was to prevent Russian tanks steamrolling their way through Germany and onto Paris and who knows where. That was always a bit of a quixotic dream in any way. But really, at the end of the Soviet Union, they were looking around for some sort of reason to be, because the bad guys were gone. In the 1980s, Gorbachev secured a deal with the government of George H.W. Bush, saying that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east of Berlin if he allowed certain changes to happen. That has been completely torn up, and NATO has just completely ignored that. They almost immediately started expanding eastwards into the Balkans, bringing in countries like Poland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and even trying so hard as to try and bring in Ukraine and Georgia. And ultimately, for Russia, that is seen as, kind of just one step too far. It's crossing the Rubicon. Ukraine, of course, in Russian means the border. And of course, Kiev is the historic home of the Russian people. In fact, the word Rus comes from the Kiev Rus, the people who migrated north when the Mongols were coming through westwards in the 14th century. They escaped northwards and founded this town around Moscow, and then from there the Russian Empire was born. And so ultimately, we do have a situation where NATO keeps pushing and pushing the boundaries eastwards, and they're testing Russia, and ultimately Russia is kind of biting back in a sense. This is kind of a conflict between two great powers. You don't need to like either of them, but ultimately this is something that is very dangerous for all of us. And where's it coming from? Well, actually, NATO has a great amount of control over our media. And this has happened quite subtly over a number of years, but really since 2016. NATO, their Atlantic Council now is in a position to advise Facebook, actually curates all of our news feeds every day. Even if you're not in the US, wherever you are in the world, the Atlantic Council is helping to curate NATO, Facebook's newsfeed. The former press officer of NATO, Ben Nimmo, is now head of intelligence at Facebook. The Atlantic Council also, one of their operatives, Jessica Ashu, is now the director of policy at Reddit, and she's taken that big social network in another direction. And so ultimately, a great deal of what we see and read online is actually being quietly tweaked and controlled by groups that are they're basically one step away from NATO. And so it's not surprising, really, that we're seeing NATO being presented as this purely defensive organization from Russian hostility, when in fact, when you start looking at the history, a much murkier, more gray picture emerges.
I want to share my screen really quick of one of my, just to go off of what you just said of how NATO is perceived or I guess portrayed in the mainstream media. At the New York Times, we have a headline here that says, "Bring back the free world." And it's like this, NATO logo right here with Biden. And it's like this defense of NATO. And it's
love the free press.
This is the free press in America, everybody, at the New York Times. And this article is basically making the case that the United States is acting through a moral lens to protect the world. And it's Russia that is trying to dominate the world and create this empire through divide and conquer. I would say that is a lot of projection. Would you guys not agree?
Oh, I mean, no, I just want to point something out. Can you go down a little bit and show the logo of NATO? I mean,
Yes.
These people don't know anything about history. Brett Stevens is a hardcore neocon. Go back up. Look at the logo. I mean, what does that remind you of? And let's keep in mind, NATO was created in 1949, just a few years after the destruction of Nazi Germany. I mean, this is like the Western liberal imperialist version of the swastika. Like,
yes.
Let's not forget that NATO's founding members included the fascist dictatorship of Portugal, which was an ally of Nazi Germany and Francoist Spain. So, I mean, like the idea that NATO is some great democratic force, they don't know anything about NATO. Operation Gladio is a well-established operation. We have so many documents proving that during the First Cold War, NATO had what was called a stay-behind network in Europe, in which NATO armed and trained former fascists and Nazis, including the Forest Brothers in the Baltic states. And NATO itself, a few years ago, created a highly produced documentary about the Forest Brothers, not mentioning that they were literal Nazi collaborators, many of whom were part of the SS and who had a loyalty oath to Adolf Hitler. Like, NATO is, if you want to be very generous, NATO is very adjacent to Nazism. So the idea that like NATO is some great democratic force, the vast majority of West Germany's Justice Department Justice Ministry during the First Cold War were former Nazis. Like East Germany, the Socialist Republic, had a thorough denazification program after World War II. West Germany, the great capitalist that, of course, later became the leaders of unified Germany and became part of NATO, they were led by former Nazis, including top NATO leaders. There were former Nazis who became the Secretary General of NATO. So this might sound like a controversial position, but I'm actually not trying to be hyperbolic. I'm literally saying that NATO has extensive links to Nazism and fascism. It was never about democracy. So the idea from Brett Stevens and all these people that NATO represents the free world, they don't even know the history of NATO. Again, one of the founding members of NATO was the fascist Portuguese dictatorship, an ally of Nazi Germany.
Well, and it's clear that NATO is, there to revive the Cold War and to push this Russophobia and to, act in defense of U.S. empire.
Well, if I can add really quickly, the real point of NATO, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
But the specific reason is to prevent Western Europe from being independent of U.S. imperialism.
Right.
The point of
That's
NATO,
right.
if
Yeah.
you listen to talks given by, like there's this website called War on the Rocks, which is like a DC Beltway podcast, and it has a bunch of people like inside the think tank bubble and all this. And I listen to it a lot because you get an understanding of how these ghouls in Washington, how they think about the world. And I remember listening to an episode I can find several months ago where one of these guys who works at some of these weapons industry funded think tanks, he said openly, the point of NATO is to keep Germany down and to keep the US on top.
Right.
That's how they say it. And they openly admit it. The point of NATO is to prevent Western Europe, one, from fighting with each other, because all of the former world wars were between Europe, right? The First World War and the Second World War were between European countries. So one, NATO keeps European imperialism unified within itself. And furthermore, it also keeps European imperialism subordinated to US imperialism. So France and Germany, which are now trying to have better relations with Russia, what is preventing them from having better relations with Russia? It's NATO. That's the entire point, is to subordinate Western Europe to the US, which is why all of these US neocons love NATO, because they understand, they might not say it openly, that NATO is what keeps Europe from having better relations with Russia. And if NATO didn't exist, in 5 days, Germany would sign a massive economic deal with Russia. France would have substantial relations with Russia. That's the only reason they don't right now, is because of NATO.
And let's talk about those financial dealings that the NATO and the United States are trying to prevent Russia from having with these European countries, including Germany and much of Western Europe, including natural gas. The United States is trying to dominate the gas industry, the market in Europe. And we could probably link many conflicts that we see around the world to that issue. The United States is trying to prevent Russia from making, economic trade deals with many countries around the world. But in this case, with Ukraine, it really comes down to the new Nord Stream 2 pipeline that Russia will supply Germany and Western Europe with natural gas for heating. And so the United States is obviously, dead against its construction. So, Ben, if you could, can you talk to us about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that the United States is trying to prevent, and then also any sort of economic deals that the United States and NATO are trying to prevent through this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, just being blunt, we have to understand that geopolitics, when we look at the geopolitics of this conflict, it's largely about gas and oil. And I think one of the reasons that we've seen these hardline hawks, anti-Russia hawks in Washington right now, and to a lesser extent in Brussels and also in London, where there's a diehard anti-Russia sentiment. One of the reasons I think they're so intent on doing this is to prevent Nord Stream 2 from being certified. Nord Stream 2 is done. It's been built over the past several years. It's pretty much ready to go. What it's waiting on is certification from the German regulator. Now, it could be a few months away from operation. It could be a year away from operation. But once it gets that certification, Russia and Germany are going to have an inextricable economic link. That's why Germany is, as I said earlier, trying to prevent a conflict in Ukraine. And it's not because the new German government of Olaf Scholz and the SPD are some great anti-war activists. No, it's because it's in the interest of Germany's economy, because Germany relies on energy imports. And where does it get the vast majority of its energy? From Russia. In fact, not just Germany. If you look at the EU, which there's a website called Eurostat. Eurostat shows all of the official EU statistics in terms of exports, imports, GDP, all of the economic stats. It shows that even as recently as last year, that Russia still provides Europe, the EU, with nearly 50% of its gas, and it provides Europe with 25% of its oil. So it's by far the largest exporter of energy to Europe. Right now, as Alan knows, there's a massive energy crisis across Europe, and prices of gas and oil have skyrocketed, and we're also in the middle of winter, and people need gas to heat their houses. Like, look, I'm very pro-environmentalist. We need to get rid of fossil fuels and move to renewables, but we also live in a system that already exists, and we don't want people to go cold, like to die in the cold because they don't have heating in their houses. So the reality is they need gas, they need oil to heat their houses, and that has to come from somewhere. Now, Washington would like that to come from the US, which is why we've seen US corporations, fossil fuel corporations, lobbying, pressuring to expand US LNG, liquefied natural gas exports to Europe. And we've actually seen that US liquefied natural gas exports have increased to an all-level high in the past 2 months, since December 2021. Right now, the US is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. I mean, beating Qatar, beating other countries. So that's the first time in history that the US has ever been the largest exporter of LNG. And that's because it's going to the EU increasingly, because these countries in Western Europe don't want to buy the gas from Russia because they're trying to push this geopolitical conflict against Russia. So a huge part of this is gas. That's why we actually just saw the Biden administration held an emergency meeting several days ago in which they discussed a plan that if there is an expansion of a war in Ukraine, I should mention, by the way, that people keep saying if war breaks out in Ukraine. Well, there's been a war in Ukraine since 2014. Yes. It's been a low intensity war, but if the war expands internationally, then the US had an emergency meeting with European leaders to discuss how US energy companies could replace the oil and gas that Russia currently exports to the EU. So I think that one of the main reasons this conflict is happening now is to prevent Nord Stream 2 from being certified. And Victoria Nuland has said as such. She said in a press conference that they're trying to prevent the certification of Nord Stream 2. Now, the irony is that the Biden administration is actually split, because we saw this attempt by Ted Cruz, which is also a reminder, by the way, that this is thoroughly bipartisan. Republicans are trying to do it too. Ted Cruz tried to introduce this bill that would block Nord Stream 2 certification by imposing new sanctions. And actually, we now know that the Biden administration whipped Democratic votes against the Ted Cruz-sponsored bill because Germany was pressuring the Biden administration to not allow the sanctions on Nord Stream 2 because Germany needs Nord Stream 2. So the reality is that gas plays a huge role in this. The last factor I should say here, which is hugely important, is that Ukraine is a transit state. That means that Russia sends huge amounts of gas to Europe through Ukraine, because if you look at a map, the gas from Russia to Ukraine has to go through a pipeline somewhere, and all of those countries, excluding Belarus, on Russia's border right now are extremely antagonistic to Russia and their Western allies. So it has to go through one of the countries, and a lot of that gas from Russia goes through Ukraine, and Ukraine gets billions of dollars in revenue from the fees from Russia sending that gas through Ukrainian territory, and also from siphoning off that gas. So for Ukraine, this is a last-ditch effort to prevent some certain hawks. We have to understand like the divisions within the states here, right? Because there are hardline far-right hawks in Ukraine who want a war with Russia. They're desperately trying to prevent the certification of Nord Stream 2 because it will prevent Ukraine from being a transit state, which means billions of dollars lost in revenue in a poorest country in Europe. And furthermore, the hawks in the US are trying to encourage a crisis in Ukraine because they want the EU to be dependent on EU energy and not Russian energy. On US energy and not Russian energy.
Alan, is this a bipartisan war that the Republicans and Democrats both support here in the United States?
I mean, ultimately, you can say yes. If you turn on Fox News, you might see some people like Tucker Carlson talking about how this is folly. But ultimately, when you, as Ben was saying, when you actually look at Republican politicians like Ted Cruz or anyone else, a lot of them are pretty much on board for this war as well. So I think we would be kidding ourselves to think that if Trump had been reelected, that there wouldn't be any sort of like hostility with Russia. In fact, quite apart from the sort of liberal projection of Trump, Trump was actually very hawkish on Russia. He sent arms shipments to Ukraine. Now that's suddenly been called lethal aid in our media. But yeah, Trump was really pushing the agenda on Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia. He certainly wasn't any sort of dove in comparison to even the Obama administration, which President Obama refused to do. And so ultimately, I think this is a bipartisan effort on behalf of the national security state and the US state more generally, because when it comes to foreign affairs, you often don't really see very many differences between top Democrats and top Republicans. Ultimately, it doesn't matter who's in charge in Washington, whether it's red or blue. They're always pro-empire. They're always pro-coup, and these sorts of things happen periodically. And right now, it's Ukraine's turn.
And speaking of bipartisan support for war, a lot of the neocons and neoliberals, which at the end of the day are really, the same thing, said that Obama did not do enough to punish Russia for its actions in Syria and its actions, in Ukraine. And so it just goes to show that it doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat. Both sides are continuously kind of competing at who can be more hawkish towards Russia and China in this, global war for dominance. Did you guys want to add anything else about the crisis in Ukraine and U.S. troop buildup against Russia before I head into the next bipartisan war and crisis in Yemen?
I'll add a really quick point that we should also keep in mind how much of this is domestic in terms of the U.S. response and the British response. I mentioned that Boris Johnson is facing a rebellion within his own party. There are conservative MPs calling for him to resign. His footing is very weak politically. So it's in his interest right now to distract the public and push for war, which is what that's what imperialist politicians always do, to distract from their internal crisis at home. And in the case of the U.S., again, as you said, not just Democrats, but also Republicans, people like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and these hardline neoconservatives, they're in a competition domestically to see who can be more anti-Russian. And a lot of it's not even about international politics. It's about domestic politics. And it's about distracting from all of the problems at home and portraying everything as the fault of the big bad Russian boogeyman or the Chinese boogeyman or whatever. And so they're being extremely irresponsible. These politicians in the US, for their own short-term domestic political gain, are trying to cause a war in Ukraine or an expanded war in Ukraine that would result in the deaths of Ukrainians. And by the way, if there is an expanded war in Ukraine, it's going to lead to even more Ukrainian refugees. We haven't even talked about Ukrainian refugees because, a few years ago, people used to talk about Syrian refugees, although it's kind of disappeared off of the media. But there already are many thousands of Ukrainian refugees who have been displaced from this slow boiling ongoing war that started back in 2014. And if there's an intensification of this conflict, where are those Ukrainian refugees going to go? They're going to go to Western Europe, which is, I think, one of the other reasons, aside from the economics of energy and all of that, one of the other reasons that Germany and France are very much not on board with expanding the war in Ukraine and having a war with Russia, because unlike the US, they're going to have to take many thousands of Ukrainian refugees fleeing a completely destroyed country right near their borders, just as countries around Syria had to take millions of Syrian refugees, and the US and the other side of the planet just continued fueling that war, which they're still doing today, and took 20,000 Syrian refugees symbolically?
And refugees are always used for political gains as well, and that's always a very sad thing when we see countries destroyed and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people made into refugees who have to flee their homes to seek safety, and then they are dehumanized within mainstream media. Why are they coming to our countries, and we can't help them, and it's just all in all a very sad situation that at the end of the day is created by this thirst and hunger for war. And I hope that everybody will stay tuned with us. We would like to move the conversation on to the crisis in Yemen. In the last week, the crisis in Yemen has really escalated. Over 200 civilians have died. Over 1,000 have been injured by an escalation by the United Arab Emirates, which we rarely hear about their activity in Yemen, but they're a major player in the war in Yemen. And through their warplanes, they bombed Sa'ada prison. They bombed many cities across Yemen and committed very grave massacres. Some of the biggest massacres that have been committed were committed during the month of January. And human rights groups, including the MSF, have basically stated that the month of January has become the deadliest month for Yemen. For those who've been following Mint Press coverage, Mint Press has been breaking the media blackout about the genocide in Yemen since 2015. We've been the leading media outlet that has correspondents on the ground who are giving us daily updates and reporting there. Over 150,000 civilians have died in this crisis, and I believe that that number is much higher. And through the U.S. Saudi-led coalition, one main actor that really is rarely talked about in this crisis is the United Arab Emirates and the role that they play in this crisis. So just to give a little bit of background and context to what has happened in the last week that basically led to this escalation is the fact that Yemen's resistance movement, the Houthis, have launched ballistic missiles as a means of self-defense over Abu Dhabi. And they targeted the UAE's oil refineries and the capital. And so this has been kind of a controversial thing because the mainstream corporate media, including many of the same media outlets that are pushing for, U.S. confrontation with Russia over Ukraine, over human rights abuses, are the same ones that have completely turned a blind eye. I mean, not necessarily turned a blind eye, but don't even give any coverage to the United States' literal genocide that it's sponsoring in Yemen. And so the Houthis now are responding in a very strong manner. They're defending themselves against thousands of bombs, US-made bombs by Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and Boeing, bombs that are raining down on civilian homes, on water facilities, on grain silos. The Saudis and the Emiratis are targeting fishermen since Saudi Arabia or Yemen has a very big fish market for food. There's a U.S. Saudi imposed blockade blocking any sort of humanitarian aid from entering the country. And so right now, today, there are over 23 million Yemenis that are facing starvation. It's a man-made crisis by the U.S. Saudi-led coalition. And I want to talk about the UAE's role in this crisis. The UAE today has been quietly occupying the southern half of Yemen hand in hand with the United States. Their military, which now presents itself as over 600,000 UAE military troops occupying the south of Yemen, are trained by the United States. They're working hand in hand with the United States to set up sexual torture sites, black sites where thousands and thousands of Yemenis have gone missing. Of course, their presence there is under the guise of fighting Al-Qaeda. And, now the Houthis are retaliating and they're reacting, resisting this sort of occupation. And of course, just to give a little bit of a broader perspective about Yemen, Yemen is, apart from just the current crisis in Yemen, the reason why the United States is in Yemen, one of the main reasons, and one of the main reasons the UAE is in Yemen, is not just about Yemen, but it's also a place where the United States has access to all of the seaports where oil flows onto the international community. And also, it's a means for the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, NATO, the UK, the same imperial actors to control the Horn of Africa, as a means to prevent China's growing Belt and Road Initiative. So I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview and a background from just a grander geopolitical perspective about the crisis in Yemen. Now, Alan, you published this really in-depth study at Mint Press about the bipartisan effort to continue to sell weapons in the billions to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But I think you've more specifically focused on Saudi Arabia. Can you talk to us about what you found in this history of the United States from a bipartisan perspective in supporting Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen?
Yeah, sure. So basically, breaking a campaign promise when he said that the war in Yemen must end and that he's got a commitment to ending US support for Saudi operations in Yemen. I found that already the Biden administration, Biden himself, has signed off on at least 20 separate weapons contracts to Saudi Arabia worth around 1.2 billion. And that's in the first year of his time in office. This includes weapon shipments of Black Hawk helicopters, of Apache gunships, of dozens of cruise missiles. And there's even a controversial deal for around $650 million, which is going through right now. And the Saudi government is using this to essentially pummel the capital of Yemen, Sana'a, and other regions. Sorting through hundreds, in fact, thousands of documents, it took me days and days. I actually found that the Department of Defense, since the start of the war in Yemen, has approved in excess of, at very least, $28.4 billion worth of arms sales from American companies to the armed forces of Saudi Arabia alone. This is an absolute floor, though, because a lot of the contracts say something like Lockheed Martin today was approved a $100 million deal to sell weapons to the governments of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Malaysia, but it doesn't give you the exact details of how much went where. Some of them are pretty clear that Saudi Arabia must have got the lion's share. So that $28.4 billion floor is actually certainly much lower than it actually is. And when you add in the rest of them, it could be as high as $63 billion. The companies that are actually making profits from this, they're pretty well known. Boeing is the number one profiteer off of the suffering of the Yemeni people. They have secured contracts worth almost $14 billion to the government of Saudi Arabia. Again, these are all absolute minimum floors. Lockheed Martin has secured $7.5 billion worth of sales, and Raytheon $3.3 billion. And there's no other company that has achieved at least $1 billion. So they're really the big three. Now, of course, Biden has actually, to give him credit, really cut down on the sorts of sales that have gone through. Trump went absolutely ballistic in 2019 and 2020. In his way out of office, he really spent the last few months of his administration rushing through all sorts of arms deals to Saudi Arabia, probably because the Saudi government was worried that Biden might cut the cord somewhat, which he has. And so ultimately, the Trump administration has dealt a huge blow to the people of Yemen. In fact, when you look at the amount of people died, as you said, it's in the hundreds of thousands now. If you divide that by the source of weapons sales, generally about for every one Yemeni who's died in this conflict, US military contractors have made around $50,000 every time.
And, I want to point out, too, that, even though the Biden administration is supposedly selling less, a lower amount of weapons to Saudi Arabia, Joe Biden himself has approved earlier this year $600 million worth of air-to-air missile defense weapons to Saudi Arabia. And so, even though he was while he was campaigning for president, he had promised and pledged to end the war in Yemen. He called it a senseless war, which is, it's not really what I believe that he believes, because he was vice president during the Obama administration, having drinks with the Saudis, mingling with them, and very close with the Saudis when the United States was and still is fueling Saudi jets mid-air. And so these politicians, I mean, when they're campaigning, we really have to be careful about like what they're saying and be really critical, and know that it's really actions speak louder than words. And so, Ben, I want to talk about the kind of the bipartisan support for the war in Yemen. One thing I want to point out is that people like Bernie Sanders have been really outspoken about ending the U.S.-Saudi war in Yemen, but he doesn't address the U.S. UAE occupation of the southern half of Yemen. He doesn't address the larger and broader imperial ambitions of the United States in Yemen overall. And so I think a lot of times people will, kind of clap for him and give him a pat on the back, like, yes, we need to hear that, which is good. It is a positive thing that he's saying that. But I mean, let's talk about the history of just, bipartisan support for the war in Yemen and what we really need to see to end this conflict.
Yeah, well, let's not forget that it was the Obama-Biden administration that started this war, supporting Saudi Arabia as it initiated the bombing on March 26, 2015. So the narrative from the very beginning is that Saudi Arabia was supposedly defending itself, but how do you defend yourself when you initiate the war by bombing your southern neighbor? And this was reflected in the language of Biden, who in the first week of February, just 2 weeks after coming into office, Biden claimed that he was ending U.S. support for so-called offensive operations. But all of Saudi Arabia's operations in Yemen are offensive by definition. How can it be defending itself? Now, the way the U.S. government tried to justify this is saying that when the Yemeni resistance forces attack Saudi Arabia with a drone attack or a missile attack, then the U.S. says that it's still going to support, the Biden administration says it's still going to support Saudi Arabia in its defensive capabilities. But again, that's not defensive, because if someone initiates a war and then the other side responds, they're not defending themselves. The side that responded defended themselves, but Saudi Arabia initiated this war. So when the Yemeni resistance attacks Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia responds, that's not defense. The Yemenis are the ones defending themselves. So Biden did this linguistic trick to try to convince people that he ended support for the war, but he didn't end support for the war. In fact, in February, after Biden claimed that he was ending U.S. support for so-called defensive operations in Yemen, he has continued selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. And again, the Blinken State Department claims that those weapons being sold to Saudi Arabia are defensive, but they can't be defensive. Let's also look at, in terms of the civilian casualties. This past week, you mentioned, we saw the bombing of a prison, of a detention center, in which over 70, perhaps over 80 civilians were massacred, many of which, by the way, were immigrants. They were refugees and immigrants who were in Yemen. Many women as well were killed, many children. And this is not the first time. Back in 2016, I remember very vividly when Saudi Arabia, with US-made bombs, bombed a funeral hall, killing over 150 people and injuring more than 500 people in this horrific massacre that was a double tap strike. So how is Saudi Arabia defending itself by doing double tap strikes on funerals? If it's a double tap strike, by definition, it is intentional. It's not an accident. And we've seen this in the statistics. Even The Guardian, the voice of British Blairism and the British national security state, has acknowledged that more than 1/3 of targets of the tens of thousands of Saudi air sorties in Yemen have hit civilian sites. The British academic Martha Mundy at the London School of Economics, who is a world-leading expert on Yemeni agriculture, she has published scholarly studies that show that Saudi Arabia, again, with the support of the US and Britain, is intentionally targeting food production in Yemen. This is not, as they say, double taps are a crime against humanity. These are intentional attacks. Saudi Arabia has been bombing agricultural sites, food storage sites, food production factories. I mean, this is an intentional strategy to use hunger as a weapon. The United Nations itself, which is usually very mealy-mouthed and doesn't take a position on these wars, it just says all sides are bad, blah, blah, blah. Even the United Nations has said that the Saudi forces, backed by the US and the UK, are using hunger as a weapon. They also have been blockading, imposing a siege on certain cities in Yemen. And of course, as you mentioned, this is a bipartisan war. It began under Barack Obama and Vice President Biden and was continued under Donald Trump, who greatly expanded the bombing of Yemen, supporting Saudi Arabia, sword dancing with the Saudi monarchy in Riyadh. And his first foreign trip as president, let's not forget, Trump's first foreign trip as president was to Saudi Arabia. And now Biden claimed that he was going to end it, but has only continued it. And you mentioned the role of the United Arab Emirates. Now, that's very important to consider as well. You mentioned that the UAE has basically taken over the South and has created these gangs of Salafi jihadis called the security belt, which is a euphemistic term. A lot of them are former Al-Qaeda people who the UAE just gives money to be so-called security. They're just hired guns, and a lot of them are hardcore Salafis, Takfiris. And not only has the UAE done that in the south of Yemen, but also the UAE has militarily occupied and colonized Socotra. I invite people to check out the beautiful Yemeni island of Socotra, Socotra, which has some of the most unique fauna in the entire world. It has some of the most unique trees and bushes. I mean, these are plants that only exist in Socotra, which is now under military occupation by the UAE. And the Saudi Arabia and the UAE can't do any of this without support from the US and Britain. Because let's not forget, what is the Saudi military? The Saudi military was literally created by the British Empire when the Saudi monarchy was created with the support of the British. And then after that, it was modernized by the US military. There is no point at which the Saudi military ends and the US military begins. The Saudi military is an outsourced arm of the US military. Everyone in the Saudi military pretty much is trained by the US military. They are flying planes made in the US, dropping bombs made in the US and Britain. And the US and Britain have had military advisors physically on the ground in the Saudi command and control centers, and they have had access to all of the lists of targets of the Saudi bombing. So we have to understand that Saudi Arabia and also the UAE, which has been involved, but not as much as Saudi Arabia. Militarily, it's Saudi Arabia that is doing most of the killing, although, again, we shouldn't let the UAE off. Right. They could not wage this war if it were not for the support of the US and Britain. When has Saudi Arabia ever waged a war without US support? It only does so when the US military is supporting it. It has no combat experience alone. And that is why it can only continue bombing Yemen because of this bipartisan support of the United States. You mentioned that, fortunately, there are some people, largely Democrats, there are even some Republicans who are against the war in Yemen. But let's be real. They have tried and they haven't done anything. They've tried passing some laws, but the vast majority of both parties still support this war because the vast majority of both parties are represented by people who are funded by the arms industry, and they want this war.
Well, and Yemen is really a strategic, country for the United States, for the military-industrial complex. And so that's why I want to read off a headline here that I just found to be so interesting, because Israel's growing role in the war in Yemen is also becoming more evident. And obviously, Israel's role in most conflicts is really, rarely talked about. And so let me just share this really fascinating headline that I recently discovered at Foreign Policy. So this one states that Yemen has become an Iranian proxy war against Israel. I think we're all just kind of laughing right away when we see this, because it's so ridiculous, because it kind of dehumanizes all of Yemen. And Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. 23 million people are starving. And the way our war-beating media describes Yemen as basically an Iranian proxy war. It doesn't portray the crisis through the proper lens, the humanitarian lens that it deserves, which is, like you very well stated, Ben, is that the Saudis are the ones who initiated this war. And the United States has been quietly occupying and using Yemen as an outpost in its so-called war on terror for decades. And so it really is really sad to see how the media portrays this conflict. But with this specific headline, Israel is now coming to surface, and the way to justify it is stating that Yemen has become an Iranian proxy war against Israel. Israel is working with the UAE, it's working with Saudi Arabia to train their military in Yemen through intelligence sharing. And also, Israel and the UAE, hand in hand, are occupying the island of Socotra. And what they've done there is they've set up an intelligence gathering hub to spy on countries like Iran and countries like China. And the goal is to control the ports that surround Yemen, because it's such an important area for not just oil to be exported onto the international community, but it's also a place where, Alan, you actually did this big investigation about how the ports near Yemen are where Israel is basically funneling weapons through ships and intelligence through ships to target Iranian scientists. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know that report was from a while back. I'll get it up here on the screen soon, but can you talk a little bit about Israel's role in these in the seaports near Yemen?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, that part of the world is super strategic. If you follow the Red Sea up from Yemen, you get to the Suez Canal, which, as everyone will remember from last year, the minute it got blocked by that ship, the entire system of world capitalism just collapsed, because nothing from Asia could get to Europe or Africa because of that, or vice versa. And suddenly, we were having like discussions about, massive shortages of whatever. But yeah, as you were talking about, you might also remember that there's been this sort of tit for tat war between Iran and Israel, with a lot of their ships mysteriously catching fire or being hit by, mines, or being hit by some sort of unexplained aerial device, which has caused a big tear in their ships. And one of them was this Israeli-owned ship owned by the Ofer family, who are the richest family in Israel. The ship was apparently going from Africa with absolutely nothing in it, while it was going around just the tip of Oman, going west into the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, where it was reportedly going to go to the UAE. But then it was hit with what most people suspect was indeed an Iranian weapon. Now, the mainstream press really talked about this as just a typical case of Iranian aggression on a defenseless Israeli ship. But if you actually look back at the Mercer Streets, that the company that it was owned by the Ofer family, their ships have actually been playing a very key role in helping the Israeli government carry out different operations all around the world. For instance, 10 years ago in 2011, the company that the Ofers were in control of was actually being investigated by both the Israeli parliament and also the US government for trading with Iran, breaking the US sanctions to trade with Iran. That seemed like a real head scratcher to a lot of people. And this Israeli investigation was going on right until the moment when somebody very high up just passed a message to the member of parliament, member of the Knesset, that was involved in this investigation. This actually happened on camera, and you can find it. She opened it up, read it. She told all the journalists to get out. And then she said, I've been handed something by intelligence. This investigation is over, essentially. And what the Sunday Times, a British outlet, found was that actually very often this shipping company has been used to help Mossad and its agents travel around the world and carry out various assassinations. Like, for instance, in the UAE, Mossad agents used the cover of this ship to actually get its agents into Dubai and assassinate a member of a Palestinian organization Hamas, actually, who was there in negotiations and actually trying to buy some stuff from the UAE. A little bit further back, they also used this same shipping company to mount an amphibious assault on Tunisia, where it killed a member of the PLO who was staying in Tunis, the capital of Tunisia. There was also the case where this shipping company had modified one of its container ships so it could actually transport Israeli aircraft, especially helicopters, inside, and they used those to attack an Iranian nuclear facility. And so this company has really been used time and time again as this sort of like front for Israeli intelligence. Now, I don't know whether Iran knew something about that ship or not. Maybe they feared it, maybe they actually knew it, or maybe they just got a little bit scared or panicky. But ultimately, Israel has used this shipping company quite often to do what it wants in the Gulf region. And that includes political assassinations, small-scale invasions, and whatnot.
And so the reason I wanted to talk about this is just to show just the importance of the United States and NATO and these countries to have control over the ports in Yemen. It's not just about oil, but it's about complete control over the region and, secretly moving around weapons and to fulfill those broader imperial plans to keep countries like China and Iran basically in check. And I just want to let everybody know that my webcam actually, something was wrong with it, so I had to switch webcams, and that's why I went offline for just a second, but I'm back and hopefully it's working properly now. And so, Ben, I want to turn to you, and we'll try to wrap this up as in the next 15 minutes or so. But I want to talk about this blackout, this internet blackout that took place in Yemen. The United States, with the United Arab Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, cut off the internet for the entire country of Yemen for several days. I mean, this is a huge, huge thing to happen. And I just can't imagine if like Iran did this to another country or Venezuela did this to another country. But the United States did this hand in hand with these two other human rights abusers. And there was literally no coverage within mainstream corporate media. What was covered within corporate mainstream media was this Russia phobia. It was this push for war with Ukraine while this was taking place in Yemen. And if you could talk a little bit about the internet blackout and kind of a history, if you will, about the United States sabotaging electricity and internet in other countries like they have, like in Venezuela.
Absolutely. I want to acknowledge that the New York Times published an article boasting that the U.S. government carried out cyber attacks on Russia's electrical grid, which, first of all, is blatantly against international law. That's a civilian target. You can't target civilian infrastructure like Russia's electrical grid. But the New York Times boasted that the U.S. attacked it with a cyber attack. The U.S. has done the same thing to Iran's civilian infrastructure. And then you mentioned the attacks on Venezuela's electrical grid during the many coup attempts in 2019 that are still going on, but to a lesser degree. So these are war crimes. These are acts of terrorism. In fact, the Yahoo News just published an article several months ago admitting Yahoo News has this team of spy whisperers, CIA whisperers, these people who the CIA leaks information to, and they're kind of controlled leaks. And they admitted that the Trump administration approved a series of unconventional warfare tactics against Iran, including targeting Iranian civilian infrastructure, destroying Iranian civilian infrastructure. Again, these are war crimes. These are acts of terrorism. And in the case of Yemen, we see the UAE and Saudi Arabia destroying Yemen's internet grid. And also because internet is linked to phones, this took down phone signals for a while as well. And I've heard that it's back up, but this is an act of war against the entire collective civilian population of Yemen. Although, as I've said, we've seen that Saudi Arabia, with the support of the US and the UK, has been intentionally targeting food production sites and trying to cause famine in Yemen. So this isn't the first time by any stretch of the imagination that they've collectively punished the entire Yemeni civilian population. But it's part of this I always say the war is basically borderline genocidal, because it's not just a war on Yemenis who resist domination. It's also a war on the collective Yemeni civilian population. And this is an act of the worst kind of war crime that you can think of. And it has total support from the United States and Britain. And why is that? You mentioned all the key details. Yemen is extremely geostrategically located. It is right on the Bab al-Mandab, which is right across from the Horn of Africa. And right there in the Bab al-Mandab going into the Red Sea, there are millions of barrels of oil that pass through every single day. And Yemen also is a southern neighbor of Saudi Arabia, which the U.S. has seen basically as its imperial gas station ever since on his last Valentine's Day in 1945. FDR met with the Saudi king, Ibn Saud, and promised that the U.S. would protect the Saudi monarchy and prevent the Saudi monarchy from being overthrown. And in return, the Saudi monarchy would provide the U.S. with oil, and even more important than providing the U.S. oil, maintain a stable price of oil in the international market and sell that oil in dollars. That came a little later, but the reality is that the Saudi sale of oil in dollars, the petrodollar, is partially what helps to undergird the de facto status of the U.S. as the global reserve currency, which is a huge economic weapon for the U.S. And we've seen this is full circle now. We've seen that the U.S., for instance, has been threatening new sanctions on Russia that would prevent Russia from getting access to dollars, which is still used in over half of international transactions, although that percentage is decreasing by the year. We've seen that the U.S. is has threatened to cut off Russia from the SWIFT system. So the reality is that Saudi Arabia plays a key role, not only in the military industrial complex, not only in the economic architecture of U.S. imperialism in terms of buying weapons, but also in terms of the status of the U.S. dollar as this hegemonic weapon that allows the U.S. to cut off entire countries economically, like Iran and Venezuela and Nicaragua, by putting sanctions on them, cutting them out of the international financial system, and preventing them from getting access to dollars. And if they wanted to sell their oil, most oil deals are still done in dollars. And that is largely, not entirely, but that is partially because of Saudi Arabia's agreement to sell its oil in the dollar, to peg or to list its oil in dollars in the international market. So Saudi Arabia plays an outsized role. You mentioned also the role of Saudi Arabia's alliance with Israel. Everyone knows that the Gulf regimes have a de facto alliance with apartheid Israel against forces of resistance in West Asia. So the final factor is that Western imperialists have used Salafi jihadist forces and Wahhabi Takfiri forces for many decades as an escape valve and as a brake on revolutionary forces in West Asia to prevent national liberation forces like Hezbollah and Ansar Allah, the official name of the Houthi movement, and forces in Iraq like the PMF. The US and Britain for many decades have used these Takfiri forces to prevent revolutionary anti-imperialist forces in West Asia from being able to take power. And imagine the influence, imagine the power that a revolutionary force could have in Saudi Arabia with all of that oil. I mean, look at what Iran is able to do, despite the fact that it's under all these sanctions and faces constant attacks. And Iran has significantly fewer oil reserves than Saudi Arabia. Imagine what could happen if a revolutionary anti-imperialist government could come into power in Riyadh. So at the end of the day, that is also the number one priority in the United States. They understand, and in London and in Brussels, they understand that a revolutionary movement like the revolutionary movement in Yemen, all they have to do is just march north. And if they can take over Riyadh and they have access to all of this oil, they can liberate all of West Asia. And then that's the end of Western imperialist control over the oil industry, which means really the end of Western imperialist control, period, because a lot of this, as we've been talking about, is undergirded by control of fossil fuels. And if you can control the price of oil in the international market, with Saudi Arabia being a key veto power in OPEC, if Saudi Arabia if it falls out of the control of the Western sphere of influence, then they lose their control over the international oil market.
Saudi Arabia is absolutely a proxy arm of the U.S. empire and is used to play many of the roles that you just described. I just want to wrap up the conversation with Alan here. I have a tweet that I want to show everybody. It is from this week's, let's see here, this week's bombing campaign. And it just goes to show that, the weapons that are being used to rain on civilians that are basically causing death, destruction, and absolute terror for civilians across Yemen. This is a part of a Raytheon bomb that was responsible for killing 82 people with just one strike. And we have to look at these think tanks that Low Key here, he's a rapper, activist, and contributor to Mint Press. He's host of The Watchdog. He tweeted this out. And Raytheon, another weapons manufacturer, is funding all of these think tanks and many more. And these are the same think tanks that are pushing for war with Russia. These are the same think tanks that many of them receive funding directly from Saudi Arabia, from Gulf countries, and from Israel. So it's like the same groups, the same nations, the same special interests are at the forefront of these think tanks. These are the think tanks that make their way within mainstream corporate media to push for war with Ukraine, to dehumanize Yemeni resistance, and to dehumanize the people of Yemen to justify the war there. Alan, what can you tell us about some of these think tanks as we wrap up here?
Yeah, ultimately, I think you're really hitting on something that these wars are really connected, even if they don't seem like it. And so often they're being pushed by certain groups in Washington and London and Brussels with an agenda to really push for more war. And so often that is the case because not only are they staffed by, former military leaders, but they're also directly in the pay of NATO and of big weapons companies like Raytheon, like Lockheed Martin, like Boeing, who are making an absolute killing off of these wars. Ultimately, maybe governments and people like us, we don't really feel the pinch of these wars. It doesn't really feel right. We don't see the bombs raining down. We only pay for these wars in taxes, but ultimately people like Yemenis are paying in blood. And these think tanks are really at the forefront of designing government policy. Very often these think tanks are based in Washington or DC or New York or London. They often write government policy and they advise the government. Their members appear on television as neutral experts, and they always seem to be wanting to push for more war or more surveillance or something that generally is in the interests of their backers. And so, yeah, listen, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin have made billions upon billions of dollars in these wars. And it just makes good business sense for them to peel off a very, very small amount of their profits and put them into think tanks, which will do the dirty work of arguing for even more wars. If you invested $10,000 in stock for someone like Lockheed Martin at the beginning of the 9/11 wars in 2001, 2003, that sort of era, you would now be sitting on something like $130,000. It's one of the best performing stocks you could have bought, except for maybe some big tech stocks like Amazon or Google. But ultimately, weapons manufacturers are the ones that are really the winners in these wars, even as the rest of the world pays for it.
Absolutely. And when talking about these think tanks and these weapons manufacturers, these are the people and the entities and special interest groups that control the narrative. And that's why and they're working hand in hand with social media tech giants to control the narrative, to control people's access to the free flow of information, and to control our news feeds, which is why it's so important to support independent journalism and to support programs like this with Mint Press and Ben Norton's new organization, Multipolarista. And so we have to continue to turn to independent watchdog journalism, but also to break the echo chamber. We don't want to just talk to each other about the issues that we already know about and care about. We have to get in touch with the people and build bridges with people on the other side so that we can engage people to understand these issues so that we can create a larger wave of change. So as long as we can, unite and get people to care about the crisis in Yemen from a humanitarian perspective and, showcase these issues from the perspective that, we are all living in a class war waged by the 1% billionaire class that is trying to divide us and keep us fighting each other so that these wars continue. And so we have to, that's why it's so important to resist any sort of censorship online, even if it's with people that you disagree with. We have to support being able to share our voices and share the information and to encourage healthy political discourse. It's so important to do that. And so we encourage that at Mint Press. And I know that you gentlemen do as well. So we really appreciate everybody joining us today for this live stream. It was a bit longer than normal. I'm a little tired, I'm not gonna lie, but I feel reinvigorated just to know that, that we were able to share this kind of information. It isn't, these perspectives and this kind of context isn't really being shared at many media outlets. And so we're happy to provide that kind of coverage. So thank you so much. Alan McLeod is a senior staff writer. And then, you can find his work at Mint Press News. And Ben, would you like to tell us where we can find your new website and your new work?
Yeah, you can go to multipolarista.com, and there's a lot of stuff in English and also in Spanish. And yeah, I'm on Twitter at Benjamin Norton. Thanks for having me. I love Mint Press. It's always a pleasure to talk with you all. It's always a fun conversation.
Thank you so much, both of you gentlemen. Thank you. Have a good day.